The silence in the bunker.
Well, I'll introduce myself first then. I'm Rebecca Levine. I'm a writer of speculative fiction, but I generally get called Bex, so if someone's talking to Bex, that's me.
I'm Kathleen Bryson. I am an evolutionary anthropologist who sometimes also writes speculative fiction as well.
I'm Stefan Sorgner. I'm a philosophy professor at John Cabot University in Rome, and I established the world's first academic journal explicitly dedicated to the posthuman, the Journal of Posthuman Studies.
My name is Volker Sommer. I'm a primatologist. That is, I work with monkeys and apes, including human apes, and I'm very interested in evolutionary theory.
So the evolution seems to be an important aspect which brings us together. And evolution with respect to technological possibilities by means of which we sort of challenge the boundaries of currently living human beings. And that seems to have to do something with the transhuman.
Although I'd make the claim that that fiction has been the driving force behind the transhuman movement, that a lot of the goals the movement is moving towards were first conceived of in fiction, and that actually it's what we imagined first that we're now trying to make possible, but maybe you wouldn't agree with that.
I don't know whether it's just like one driving force. I mean, there's so many like ancestors of this, of the transhumanist thinking, and you can find it also, many religious thinkers in sort of the beginning of the 20th century in Russia were very interested in this kind of thinking, but also science fiction writers, of course.
Yes.
Belyaev, for example, is an amazing driving force, I think.
And the entire cyberpunk movement, which is slightly out of fashion right now.
You could go back even further. Obviously, you could go back to the development possibly in mammals. I'm not even talking just hominins or maybe even gray apes. Symbolic thought is present, which allows us to be able to speculate in this way as well. So it's not necessary. I don't think of it at all as a new development. Religion is not at all a new development. There's Volker could probably talk more of it, but there's indications of symbolic, potentially ritual thought in other great apes as well. So this would allow us to have the capacity right from the beginning to speculate, to use tools, so I don't think of it as unnatural or a new development. I think it is part of ourselves as animals, which, yeah.
So if I think about the trans, so I would want to question the human boundaries to, let's say, the left side, that is the human-animal boundary, and say, I, at least as an evolutionary biologist, I am an animal, and in that way connected with all the other living beings. And then looking ahead, or being in the present now, the other trans would be, how are we intermarrying with inanimate entities, including machines and so on. So it's the human-animal boundary which is questioned, and the the human-machine boundary which is questioned.
Just to comment on that the issue I'm in general agreement, but the issue I might have with that is the conceiving along a spectrum line as opposed to a holism. So because that's a spectrum from left to right, it implies directionality, which natural selection is not. This is one of the issues I sometimes have with transhumanism, is that evolution is not directional at all. So we don't often, I don't know if it's possible, and I'm obviously just thinking on my feet right now, this is not a developed theory, but if we could somehow have a holism that incorporates our animal selves, maybe our machine selves, maybe ourselves as we find ourselves today, that might be a different way of conceiving rather than a spectrum.
That's interesting. So one of the things I was going to say is that I think that sense of intermixing is usually conceived of as corrupting in both directions. In fact, you get sort of things like The Island of Dr. Moreau, which is, the horror of human-animal intermixing, and then cyberpunk itself, which is the predominant transhuman genre, is a dystopian genre. It imagines everything going wrong when we start mixing ourselves in that way. And I think maybe if we could conceive it holistically, we wouldn't see it as a corrupting influence to mix ourselves with the other.
Actually, just the notion of the transhuman is not so predominant within this transhumanist discourse. What is used actually more often is even the posthuman. But the notion of transhumanism is fairly new. I mean, it was only coined in 1951 by Julian Huxley, who was also the first director of the UNESCO and was responsible in establishing the Declaration of Human Rights, or was involved in formulating the human rights. So it's only been like 70 years where this notion was attached to this way of thinking. But yeah, in general, and I think this is what makes it such a dangerous way of thinking is that it's a new conceptualization of who we are as human beings, in the sense that it breaks away from our Western tradition, the Western cultural tradition, which always thought, well, it's a rational, immaterial rationality which makes us special, which makes us, we are the only ones, humans are the only ones who possess a divine spark, who are categorically separate from the rest of the natural world, and only since sort of, well, with Darwin, with Nietzsche, with all these thinkers, so it's become more and more important that we are fully part of the natural world order. We've come about as a consequence of evolutionary processes, so there's a chance that, yeah, of course, we can also die out, or we will develop further eventually. In 400,000 years, it's highly likely that we as human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, will no longer exist. And now, together with the possibilities of emerging technologies, it's become a need to discuss the limits, how we are supposed to use them, and what that means to us, our self-understanding as human beings.
And do you think some of the sort of transhuman movement is to do with wanting control over that process of change? I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot, about the sense that one is given a body but doesn't choose it. Because at the age of 50, I chose to have a tattoo for the first time, and I was thinking about what motivated me to do that. And it's something I decide about my body. I put it there, and nothing else about my body was decided by me. I mean, my haircut. And I wonder whether that sense that we don't know what the selective pressures on us are now, we don't know what we're going to change into, but the transhuman movement says, well, we can do this and we can do that and we can direct that. I don't know if that resonates with you at all.
Yeah, we can do that, but in a way, we've always been altered. We've always been altered not only by ourselves, but also in particular by our parents. So the first upgrade which we got was basically the upgrade of language. That makes us turn into cyborgs, cybernetic organisms. And cyber stands for the steersman of a ship. So we've always been altered organisms as human beings. Once the parents started to upgrade us with language, that was the first upgrade. And the next upgrades were all part of educational processes, mathematics, history, This is all alterations. And these alterations, some of them have also altered our genetic level by means of epigenetic processes. So genes were turned on and off, and how the genes were located towards each other. So environmental changes have always had an effect also on our genetic level.
But some people might argue, then I agree, but also those changes that you're calling upgrading, they are in essence replacing biological processes. They're still part of the sum of ourselves as animals.
Exactly.
And so I don't think, you're not arguing against that anyway, are you? It's maybe even something like the incest taboo or something in human societies. We have a cultural function that allows us to avoid inbreeding, even if we possibly don't necessarily have a biological function, but the end result would be the same. And so culture is the tool, which is sort of what I think you're getting at. Culture itself, which would include the linguistic capabilities, is the tool that allows us to then react to our environment and survive and reproduce, etc.
Yeah, but then since, as Volker's argued, which I totally agree with, animals have culture.
Yeah.
Then one can really meaningfully talk about sort of trans-corvidism or because... Yeah, the same process goes for them.
Or maybe more likely dolphins, potentially, because at least we've had some, or bonobos, where there at least have been attempts for us to communicate, not just on our own terms, but in their terms.
But corvids have culture. They
oh, absolutely.
They teach their offspring things they would not automatically develop.
That's correct.
So that is, you would say that is a trans-corvid enterprise.
Yeah. I mean, there's sort of this widely shared prejudice that what transhumanists desire is just to turn into Superman on Viagra or Wonder Woman with Botox, but that's sort of, there is this element in transhumanism. But actually, many more of them argue also for like a wide plurality of choices to promote diversity and plurality by means of new technologies. And for example, there's no reason in the end, sort of, why incest should be illegal. That's a nice example, actually. Incest now, that's such a widely shared taboo, but once we've established sort of autonomy as a fictional norm, it's a fictive norm. It's a wonderful achievement that we've got the freedom now that the religion does not have the right to tell us how to live our good lives, and now we can make a decision. And it could be a contract, that brother and sister, father and son, as long as they're competent adults, decide to have sex together. And luckily this has already been recognized in countries like Spain, where incest among competent adults is legal.
Actually, I was arguing quite differently.
but I was stressing a different thing.
I understand. What I was saying is the society still would have the taboo, and that would then function the same way, like being able to sniff out their MHC and be able to tell I'm this related, which I actually think we can do anyway, because there seems to be some recent studies that in the last 3 weeks have said that we actually can do kin recognition at that level. But leaving aside the fact as consenting adults, which for me, consenting adults, I'm still quite personally squeaked out by the thought of it. But the society in this case would be the ones who are the gatekeepers, but it's still functioning as part of biology because it's the environment. So I'm not saying society is always right about these boundaries, but it would be replacing so our culture becomes a prosthetic itself. It becomes the culture, which is what I think you were saying initially. It's the culture, which you were calling the upgrading, which is the extension.
I suppose my concern, I think I totally agree with you with diversity, but my concern about a lot of what I have read of transhumanism is that it's quite a libertarian project. It's about even individual choice, and increasing it is great, but we are fundamentally a social animal, and unless we sort of elevate universally or change universally, I think this causes problems, and also it obviously raises issues of access and equality. It's sort of in the public media, it's often represented, identified with sort of many of the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and there are some problematic people who are in favor of transhumanism, but actually they are seen as problematic within the movement as well. And so there's, for example, as a counter position, like the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and most of the people involved in there are rather sort of social democratic transhumanists, or some even like, some association with rather communist understandings. They all still remain on a liberal basis.
So there's still in that case, the boundaries are like intracultural within the transhumanism.
Exactly.
So there are then again, it's fulfilling the function of kind of, not gatekeeping is not quite the word, but kind of monitoring is not the word either. Reining in the worst impulses. Potentially what we might have a tendency towards as animals who can't really look that far into the future.
People basically, many of the sort of the transhumanists are worried that it's only for the rich, it's only silicon, and that will lead to massive gaps between the better off and worse off, basically the Gattaca example, and it would lead to a split in human society. And many are extremely worried about this and want to, and that's why there arises a need to talk about the possibilities, how to make things accessible to.
And also in terms of a potential apocalyptic level dangers for human society that we as a society as a whole should decide about. Like I believe there are tech companies in Silicon Valley who are overtly working to bring about the singularity. That is not something we should bring about without discussion. It shouldn't be one group of individuals that choose to make so massive a transformation.
I actually think, singularity, together with the singularity is sort of the idea usually associated that human personality gets put on a hard drive, mind uploading as an option. It's important to stress, this sort of silicon-based transhumanism is not what all transhumanists have to affirm. So there's a carbonate-based transhumanism as well as a silicon-based transhumanism. I, for example, think, I don't even think we don't have any reason to believe that mind uploading would work, because our personality, if it was possible to put it on a hard drive, then we would want that nothing gets lost. However, so we would have to still be alive. In a digital version, we would still have consciousness, but so far we don't. There's no silicon-based entity which is alive. Because even the best example would be a computer virus, which is a self-replicating entity, but even that doesn't have metabolism, which we would demand, ask of. And so all the arguments in favor of mind uploading, singularity, they're just a way of getting media attention, and they don't have any practical relevance.
Although, we haven't solved, obviously we're nowhere near solving the hard problem of consciousness, so we don't in fact know if there will come a time when we produce a silicon entity that it becomes spontaneously conscious. We just can't know, because we don't know what produces consciousness. We don't know what the link is between matter and consciousness.
I felt quite reassured. I cannot remember who the scientist was, but reading I think it was a New Scientist as well, which is basically my version of Cosmopolitan magazine when I want to relax. But there was an article about how most of the mechanisms in evolutionary theory regarding cooperation and reciprocal altruism would also kick in anyway with complex systems in terms of costs and benefits. And I felt quite reassured by that anyway. I thought, well, even if this does happen, then actually it would be following generally the fundamental laws of physics, and probably cooperation will always, if you're social, will give you the greatest benefits. Now, being social, it might be being social in a very different way than what we're used to, but our experience so far, not just with ourselves, but with other organisms who are social organisms, is that cooperation is generally helpful as long as you get a benefit for yourself.
But don't you think being embodied is quite fundamental to our nature, and that we can't begin to imagine what an unembodied consciousness
that's why I just gave the caveat that I don't know what it might be very different, but maybe I was self-deluding, which is also a human trait, to feel reassured. As long as reciprocal altruism kicks in,
it'll be okay.
It's okay.
We cannot exclude the possibility that it will happen eventually. But all of these prophets who claim, like Kurzweil, who claim it will happen within the next 30 years, I think that we have no indication for that happening.
Time is ticking, and I was thinking it's not.
It's not. We've got really urgent challenges to deal with. But this is an interesting issue to think about. But technology leads to other challenges which we urgently have to confront.
I think some of the focus on the singularity is an artifact of despair as well, that we feel like our social and environmental problems are so insoluble, we need something smarter than us to sort them out for us. And I think that's where some of the drive towards it is coming from, a distrust in our own ability to solve our own problems.
But in particular, once we see now these developments associated with digitalization and RFID chips entering all aspects of our life world, and together, in particular, with the developments in China, which I find absolutely interesting.
Yeah, I went to what's his name, Phil. I went to his book launch a couple of weeks ago in London. That was interesting.
Can you tell us
I think first the Chinese, they actually praise the latest technologies, both with respect to digitalization as well as with respect to genetic modification, CRISPR-Cas9, genome editing, and from 2020 onwards, the social credit system will be universally applied in all over China, which means, and that's already in place in some parts of China, which basically, on the basis of your actions and all of your digitized action in particular, you receive a specific social credit, a value. And once your value is too low, you're banned from booking flights, train rides, 4- and 5-star hotels. You're being offered less possible partners on the Chinese version of Tinder, and it already has a lot of practical implications. For example, there was a young boy who passed the entry exams to a university, but his dad didn't pay back his credit. And that's because they are employing a relational ethics. So it's not you who's responsible, but sort of also your friends' activities have a relevance, a bearing on your value. So his value dropped, and he was not allowed to study because his dad didn't pay back a certain credit. And only after he paid it back, he was allowed to enter university. And this will be employed nationwide from 2020 onwards. And together with chips entering all aspects, permanent surveillance, surveillance cameras, sort of all your financial transactions. That would have a massive influence on...
I mean, this sounds obviously incredibly dystopian, and none of us want to live in that system, but at the same time I can see that in a sense it's trying to reproduce and I'm totally blanking what the number is, but I'm sure you all know that the number... Dunbar's number, that none of us live in Dunbar communities anymore, and this sounds like a way of trying to sort of create a digital version of the social sanctions that come from living in Dunbar number community.
I mean, I'm pretty sure there's a Black Mirror episode that maybe they're getting their inspiration from this. I'm pretty sure I remember that. They really are.
10 million credits
also,
or something.
It also thinks about what happens. Maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, I remember I was and even in early days of the cloud, I was quite reluctant. But my skepticism has always proved true about how safe stuff was when it was being uploaded, how much of my information is being shared with others. And I am not particularly keen about signing up to any program that requires that I check in through Facebook, etc. What about people like myself who might want to opt out in such a situation in China? What happens if I don't have a digital footprint?
You can't.
I can't. So then I have low numbers because I can't.
I mean, you can't.
That's
even
problematic
opt out.
to
In a way,
me.
you can't opt out of Facebook because if some of your friends are on Facebook and they take a picture and you're sort of on one of these pictures, they have a specific. I mean, they have you in Facebook as an identity without you being on Facebook. No, there's no way to opt out, and in particular in a system like China, where it has legal consequences I mean, just by having any kind of insurance number, a health insurance number, you're already within the system.
No, I'm aware of that, but there's levels of involvement, and so what it's curious to me is that it's the tacit, which is what I objected to several years ago. It's the tacitly goading me into having to participate when I do not want to participate, or sometimes I do want to participate, and so that is also extreme social pressure, not just in how you relate to it, but the initial act of saying a person, if you're not participating digitally, then you're not part of our society. You're not social.
Well, it's because in many ways we live in a data economy, and we generate value through the data we generate, and that's
I understand what's behind
but I'm saying,
it.
so I don't know how you escape it when that's what society wants you for now.
And
I'm curmudgeonly is how I deal with it. I'm aware that I am a set of data points, and I sometimes try to screw with it or hack it,
Yeah. But it's difficult, isn't it? Because, like you're saying, because it's not because other people are providing data on you. It's not just you who's doing it.
And probably they have a prototype of a subversive personality like myself who would be prone to doing that. Well, that just fits our predictions for
here's an algorithm
Kathleen
for that.
Type. Yeah.
Now let's see the positive sides of these processes. Actually, there are a lot of interest, personal interests related to the digitalization. When it comes to sort of psychological studies, for example, confirm that more than 90% of the people identify a longer health span, a longer sort of lifespan during which we're healthy, with a higher quality of life. And so by collecting personalized data, it is possible to identify what are the correlations between our lifestyle and the likelihood of getting certain diseases, our genes, and all the companies and countries they all want our genetic data. In the US, we've got a private market, which is like 23andMe, and they've got more than 5 million clients who have their genes analyzed. In Estonia, they've made sort of the arrangement, well, we as a government, we want to support you getting to know you better. So we will pay for genome analysis.
Wow.
If you share the results with us. In Kuwait, they had a different solution, and they made it for some time. They've abandoned it now, but they made it for 2 years. I think it was legally obligatory for all visitors and for all citizens to deliver a tissue sample.
Wow.
All the same motive. They all want, genetic data. Why? The more data we have, the more we can see the likelihood of getting certain diseases, how we respond to drugs, which capacities we have. And, it has some problematic implications, or potentially very problematic implications. On the other hand, the more information we have, the more we can influence that, and the more the likelihood of our expanding our health span. Again, this is, and that's a strong human interest.
And a counterpoint to that might be, for example, with NHS Digital in the UK, which I opted out of sharing my information, has now been sold to private property. It was a communal resource in which the argument could be made, which I still decided at the time I did not. Ironically, my postdoc recently was trying to convince people to give me their digital data in order for a very good project about well-being. Yeah. But at a personal level, I did not ever allow my digital, and I might be coming from I'm from a very long-lived family, so I'm not particularly concerned about that, because people tend to live to 94, 95 in my family, and so that's possibly feeding into my kind of cavalier out. But I think there's the fact that the NHS then said they would not, or alluded that they would not share the data, then has sold it and is in the process of selling it to American hyper-capitalist institutions, which are monetizing it, is problematic. Yeah. It's so the motivations might be very good and very useful. Like for the postdoc project I just worked on, it's amazing that you can get this digital stuff, and it will improve people's lives if we can show these particular links. But on the other hand, the capacity for social cheating is a problem, and this is what post-humanism probably is more adept at negotiating, but transhumanism perhaps not to the same level of how to deal with social cheating, which kind of goes back to what you first said about like certain groups of people exploiting the best instincts of us.
The issue with opting out, I mean, this is I'm not happy about the total surveillance. I try to avoid it. However, I'm also considering what are the implications concerning research, possibilities of making social research is based on scientific research is based on data. And we've got a very good, in Europe, a very good universal healthcare system. And healthcare is very expensive. So basically, if a company in the US, and in the US there was a possibility for some time to patent genes. There was a patent on the breast cancer gene. So anyone who wanted to have a analysis would have to pay them whatever money they want. So in a way, it makes sense. I mean, the companies invest a lot of money in order to find out the information, and it's very risky research, and they spend a lot of money, and not many drugs get FDA approved, and so on. So that's the underlying logic for keeping the intellectual property. To finish that, on the other end, so in a way, if we give away our these data about ourselves, that could be a way for us to paying the financially supporting the universal healthcare system. It's a way, because we deliver the data, and so we keep the rights on some of the results of the outcomes, so the companies don't have the right to charge whatever amount they want.
I do take that argument, and I think some of the backlash against big pharma, it doesn't take into account the fact, as you're saying, it's very expensive. But I think the trouble is, as part of late capitalism, the same sort of process goes on that went on with mortgages, where they chop it up and they sell it on again. And so them having access to the data that allows them to develop drugs, great, but then them selling it to an insurance company that decides
That
what
was
to
my
make my
issue.
premiums,
Yeah.
and you lose, well, as soon as you don't possess your data, you lose all control over it, and then you have no say
And
in
then
who uses it.
Going back to a point you made, I have actually spat in the tube, but not yet sent off my 23. In a way, I don't have to. My mother, 2 of my brothers, my father, my uncle, and 4 first cousins have done it. I mean, my data is practically there
Yeah.
anyway, and I have had no choice over that. Anyway, I will probably. I'm still quite interested, but my choice has been taken away from me.
Exactly.
I feel like I don't participate in a lot of social media, but I still feel like I'm like the Mandelbrot man. I'm still the very void that is me is defined by all the noise around it, so I can't escape description in this
Well,
world.
now my genes have become the description around. Is that not? Would you not say that's the case? Like
Yeah,
it's there.
of course, it's there. That's the thing. Sort of, if one takes sort of a liberal solution and says, no, well, person X or your brother has the genes analyzed, and so they got the results. Do they own the results themselves? If they own the results themselves, then they could put it online to make it generally accessible. However, you're sharing most genes with them. So basically, if they put it online, in the end, some insurance company could get hold of it, and they say, "Oh no, these genes don't look so good. We don't want you." Or potential employer in the future say, "No, with such a high risk of getting a stroke."
Or an immigration service.
You know,
I mean, it's
sexual orientation, depending on what is part of the.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It feels dangerous but inevitable, I think, is the problem.
Inevitable, well, because it's so important for making research, and the other element is actually, so in the US, the data is collected privately, but in China, they get even more information because it's enforced. And because of them getting all the information, and because of the dependency of scientific research, policy making, and other interests with it, in Europe, this information is also needed for these purposes. So do we then have to pay the Chinese the money for making research? Because the data is so fundamental for any kind of use in engineering, for using, precious substances, for any kind of working, it will be even more important. So that has the consequence. They are making more money, they're getting richer with respect to us. So we will see a social economic decline in Europe. Aren't we then forced to give up the data? This is sort of.
Is that how you see the trajectory going? Do you think that's quite likely?
I think that's very likely, and as
I do too.
consequence, we will claim minority groups, immigrants, any kind of minority groups for that social economic decline in Europe. That will lead to tensions within the groups, because in particular, in the first instance, it will concern sort of the middle class. They will find some scapegoats, and so this will be minority groups. Tensions increase, and that will lead to civil war. That's sort of the future of Europe, and we'll be the gladiator in Italy, in Rome, or we'll be the gladiator doing the gladiator dances for the Chinese visitors. And the only reason why the Chinese will come over is because of visiting Louvre and the Colosseum and enjoy the pizza, but not for scientific or economic reasons.
But I think the and I don't want to in any way be sort of justifying, the Chinese system of government, but if we start giving our data up over here, we won't be giving it up to our governments. We'll be giving it up to private mega corporations. And is that? I don't know. Is that at least a government is acting collectively for a people?
Maybe that's what we have to do then. Sort of find a liberal to promote freedom much more than it already exists. I mean, much more. But on the other hand, find a way of us governments, maybe a free alternative, a European social credit system, where the governments decide. Maybe surveillance is being done by computers, by algorithms then, in order to restrict the access of humans having access to the data. And that's one of the greatest risks associated with it, because governments, people in charge, they will all be corrupted eventually. They will use it against you. So the way to limit the access and the limit who they can sell it to, these are some of the tricky issues.
I think it comes back round to I think the appeal of the singularity is the sense that if only there was some dispassionate, disinterested entity we could pass it on to, great things could come of it. But there's no human-created entity we trust with this much information.
Because of the cheating issue.
With the cheating.
Corruption.
And because of the profit motive, which is
cheating.
Yeah.
Social cheat.
And that's the reason why I think sort of the American version is not in our interest. I mean, because in there they've got the liberal version, sort of the companies have the right to collect the data. But the more data they get and the more they get exchange data, they will in the end turn into a political institution, because data is power.
Yeah.
And power, they can influence then political. That's not what we want.
No.
So if there's a need to collect data, so if we want to keep it, some sense of justice, then it would have to be done by a governmental institution, no?
At an opt-in level, I would suggest.
I would, this is a tricky issue. I would want that too. Sort of, is that realistic? What would be the opt-in level then? Those who don't subscribe to it don't have universal health insurance?
Well, my information...
Would have to pay higher charge? I mean, this basically,
The trouble is this is all coming at a time when there's increasing and quite justified distrust of government as well.
Exactly.
All across the world, really. And, the rise of populism. And I wouldn't want a populist government to have access to this data. When you give it to a government, you give it indefinitely to the future to everyone that ever gets elected, and you have no control over that. And I don't know what the answer is.
Exactly.
Let me lean back.
All right.
Or everybody lean back.
We're leaning in.
Leaning in. So we have now talked for half an hour, and I kept a little bit of a record, and I just want to go back to some of the keywords and see where we are. So, and there was exciting stuff, words I had never heard, like transcorvidism, which I find very, very exciting. So the idea that, of course, other types of animals will also perhaps be able to become another type of society based on information systems. But let me say the train of thought which I saw here was that Julian Huxley was mentioned, and as the one who allegedly coined the term transhumanism, and he also 1951, and he coined that interesting term evolutionary humanism too. And that's of course where my own interest is. So his idea was that in order to be more aware of what's going on, of course we have to first recognize, yes, we are humans. That is our very restricted perspective. And previously, of course, there was humanism as the big, new, good way of not being shackled by divinism, which is we were free from religious rules, and that was humanism, and that set us on the course of our own action. However, we forgot that we are surrounded by other creatures, which are the animals and the plants, and we forgot that we have a history which is much longer than our little historical processes. And that is what is actually my understanding of transhumanism. So it's not only that part which is the post-humanist aspect we were largely talking about, but also the pre-humanist parts, like there were times when humans didn't exist. So in that sense, there was trans, and so we have that nice dynamics between pre and post-humanism. And the other, perhaps, pair of words would be eugenics and eutechnics. So evolution was in some ways a process of eugenics, because evolution would always reshuffle genes, and then somehow through cooperation and competition, those who were better able to whatever have social credit or be genetically fitter, leave more offspring. And now we have eutechnics. And the question is that always you? Because you means good. So there, the idea of eugenics being good breeding and eutechnics being the good use of technology. And then we talked about, of course, it feels dangerous, but it's inevitable. So
I'm not sure I'd sign on to to not making a distinction between evolution and eugenics as we understand it, because I think eugenics is about an imposed directionality decided by humans.
That's
and
okay,
but I suppose because I'm Jewish, that's quite a fraught question for me, and the idea that the eugenic movement was merely copying evolution, I find quite problematic.
That's what, of course, in a very trivial way, they said they were doing, which, of course, was totally ill-informed. However, we are all basically ascribing to eugenics because we want to somehow better our lives and make sure that the next generations are healthy and so on. And in the Jewish community, for example, when certain people want to marry, they will conduct tests whether there are certain genetic problems, and that is eugenics. Of course, never mind how the word has been tainted.
Yeah.
And
I object for. I generally sign on to your summary, but I still hold what I made at the very first point, is that I do not feel it needs to be this dichotomization between pre and future. I think there must be a way of conceiving of this in a more holistic way, rather than a spectrum. I know that we are limited because we think in spectrums and we think in directionality, but maybe that would also come into this idea of eugenics. Which I'm not comfortable with the word.
And also, I think you're suggesting that eugenics is always, even in that sense of wanting health, is unproblematic. I mean, the deaf community might take issue with that.
Oh, yeah.
That they very strongly feel that they're being sort of, wiped out through that kind of selection.
Not all. I mean, the deaf community is actually
some elements of the deaf community.
Into parts. I mean, on the one hand, some claim sort of deafness is just it being different. Others might claim it is a it's a handicap, but in order to claim healthcare benefits, because otherwise, if it's just being different, they wouldn't be supported by the healthcare, which is again sort of the financial aspect. But that's an interesting question, which is also quite discussed as part of this discussion. Sort of, there was this deaf lesbian couple in the U.S. Who. They were both university professors, and they argued in this way, and their deafness is just being different. We consciously want to have a deaf child. And I think because deafness is being different, actually in our circumstance, we teach at the university where mostly deaf people are, it's actually an advantage. And so they consciously selected a donor from the deaf community in order to increase the likelihood of the child being deaf. And I think that's a perfectly, if we take seriously the notion of otherness, if we take seriously the notion of negative freedom as an achievement where parents, can certainly make educational decisions also, that one can decide who to have offspring with, and here the offspring is not harmed because the offspring wouldn't be there. It's not taking something away, and so here the technology is involved in order to consciously select a partner here or increase the likelihood of the child being deaf is a perfectly legitimate choice, and this is something.
And deafness has its own culture. I mean, sign language is a language unique to the deaf community, or parts of the deaf community.
Yeah, but even if you would now consciously want to have a child which has certain traits and let's say be deaf and enrich society, that would still be eugenics, because that's your own eugenics. That is all I want to say. I'm not defending certain practices.
No, I'm not. I wouldn't suggest for a second you were, but what I'm saying is that I think that there is a divide between the sort of the random choice that goes on in evolution and eugenics, where you are making moral decisions about.
So that harps back to what Kathleen was objecting to, because she was saying, obviously evolution doesn't have a direction, and I sort of object to this suggestion. However, if you look back, in hindsight, of course, evolution did have a direction. So you can only ever...
In hindsight.
In hindsight, yes. So there was a direction. Of course, there could have been multiple others. So there was one historical process which did take place. And that is simply the result of how the game played out. So initially, when you now look forward, you can't predict how evolution would go. There will be certain constraints, so it's very unlikely that within 5,000 years we will evolve wings or something like that, because we are constrained. But there is a directionality which is not a progression and which is not predictable. However, de facto, there is one. And so...
Yeah, I do buy on. I do sign on to that. Progression is perhaps the objection. I have.
Or goal directed.
A goal at the end, which I think is often influenced by our own present culture's biases about what prototypes look like, what a face should look like, what a human body should look like. These are our own biases, and you could argue, oh, well, there are certain, evolutionary psychologists would argue, well, there's tendencies. Well, I have read a lot of those evolutionary psychologist papers, and there's a lot of just so stories behind a lot of that as well. Some of it may well be a tendency, but we have so much variability that the deaf lesbian couple, that's like a bumpiness. These are the variables that make it unable to be predictive, I think. And that's why I'm thinking I don't know even if we could have a non-time-based way of conceiving of this.
Yeah, but that's the interesting tension. So let's say in the purely biological processes of whatever that may be and what we call selection, which is of course a highly problematic term because it implies that there is a quasi-rational force at work. And of course that's not meant what is by selection, so it is only quasi-rational. That's why there is no teleology, but a teleonomy. It just looks as if there is a goal.
I would object to selection necessarily being a rational.
No, there is not, of course.
There's not, no. Because selection, and that's sort of the issue with eugenics has obviously connotation with the third right. It has the connotations of being sort of institution making a choice, a political system making a choice. That's not what we're talking about at all nowadays. That no serious person would want to have such a structure. We talk about now individuals making a choice for themselves and parents making a choice for their offspring.
Yeah, but hang on. You were the one who suggested that. Okay, look. Yes, there is the danger of private companies exploiting that, and the danger that we cannot opt out, but we will be opted in. And by the way, we all agree that you shouldn't opt out to have your kids schooled. You shouldn't be able to opt out to have vaccination, perhaps. So there's a lot of perhaps where we would say yes. There should be a force.
I was not arguing that we should not say yes to vaccinations, to public schooling.
You don't have opt out.
No, but I'm allowed to opt in and opt out on different levels. That's what I'm asking for. I'm arguing for variability.
But I was then coming back to your point, which you were actually making, that you said, okay, look, I mean, perhaps at the very end we should allow that Leviathan, which is the state, to somehow make the best of those possibilities instead of allowing the private companies and the capitalist like money makers to do it. And so there, of course, we have conflicts which we need to negotiate. And that, I just want to bring that back to what the point was about the directionality. So while perhaps we can only infer a direction in evolutionary processes once they have happened, once we are with the eugenics, and that was also mentioned, there are perhaps conscious choices now where we can actually now preempt a goal and we work towards that goal. So now that sets a very interesting conflict. So let's say evolution happened and then the direction was not planned but it's just inferred post hoc. But now pre hoc we will want to work into a certain direction. Is that so or is that not so?
I hope sort of the governmental influence will only relate to maybe something which is widely shared, really like health issues, expanding health spans. Otherwise, freedom, negative freedom, absence from constraint. This is such a wonderful achievement as a consequence of the Enlightenment process. We have the right to individually decide according how we want to live our lives and not to be told by religious leaders, by political leaders, sort of this is, my state, my religion, this is how you have to live.
Yeah, but you are contradicting yourself because you were saying that health and to live a better life is intrinsically tied.
No, not intrinsically.
Okay,
widely shared. That's very important.
But what is widely shared? So where do you stop now? So you would, of course, that brings us back to that very problematic area of how should we rein into people's bodily lives through healthcare. So, of course, that rather abstract idea of being free and having, your own ways of life. But it will very quickly come back to the point that our lives are tied into a body. And so what is that? So our body will just be a free-floating entity, and the liberty thing is just the consciousness.
But to me, the problem is not about embodiment, it's about the fact that we are social, and even individual freedom is not, our individual choice are not made in a vacuum.
Yeah, but social norms can also, of course, create terrible things.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And so that is, of course, a problem which will always be there. So that we are social creatures doesn't help at all to kind of ensure that from certain perspectives we don't do morally despicable things.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's why I think sort of being utopian about individual choice can be a bit self-deceiving, because it won't be a freely made choice of utter rationality. It will be constrained by social structures which can be, deeply harmful to certain subsections of society.
Yes, but so can so there is no escape. That's what I want to say.
Yeah.
And in the very end, the values to which we ascribe will still be rather random, and they will maybe have functions to signify belonging to groups and so on, but they are not intrinsically good or bad. They are just like good or bad from a certain historical perspective.
But it becomes, I think and I agree with your idea of negative freedom, that doesn't impact others. One, as an adult, should be free to do what one chooses with one's own body. I think that's sort of foundational to my belief system. But some of these changes one talks about making are heritable. And so it's not just a choice you're making for yourself, it's a choice you're making for your children. Then it becomes a public matter. It's not a simple individual choice, unless you think you have the absolute right to make those choices for future generations.
Yeah, but would you think that you shouldn't make any choices for your children? Yes, perhaps we would think that is a good idea, but then of course you would hand over the fate of your children completely to these blind processes of biological evolution.
I don't know what the answer is.
Yes, that is what I want to say. I don't know what the answer is, so there is a conflict.
Yes.
I also don't know what the answer is.
Maybe you do. You look like you might know what the answer is.
Sort of
Stefan.
the way I deal with that. Sort of, we look for, if we're confronted with new technological challenges, we should look for a structural analogy with which we've had more experience in the past. So, for example, if we talk about genetic modifications, and there are good reasons why, sort of by means of if people want to have them done to themselves, I think that's not so problematic in most instances. There are always some problematic cases. It becomes problematic when parents are making decisions over their children's genetic modification. But we do have experiences concerning such procedures with respect to education. Education can have irreversible consequences as well as reversible ones. So I would suggest actually in the same way, the same norms as we have in education, we should apply to the issue of genetic modification. So there are some changes which are morally wrong and others which are morally legitimate. So we just need to, and as a society, and that's what we do, we need to decide this is when it becomes child abuse. This is when it becomes something which we don't want.
In the same way that we don't allow sex-selective abortion, that's not permitted. But there are, but I think people might find that a hard pill to swallow, the idea that their choices about their child are something that actually have to be made collectively. I mean, I totally agree with you. But I think that'd be a hard sell.
There you are really into the hardcore eugenics movement, because of course there was the whole idea, and that was of course the, I believe, mistaken idea that societies should now do the selective breeding in a structured way, which takes away the personal liberty. And if you now just hand that over to the parents, then of course, you are just postponing the problem again, because then parents may make bad choices, or let me say a government which is enlightened may make good choices. So how do you get out of that problem?
I mean, education can go wrong. Some people don't like to be taken to piano lessons. I mean, but in general, at least, and then there are some procedures where the risk is too high. Obviously, that's when the government needs to enter. That these are changes which parents shouldn't have the right to make. But on the other hand, no, still that is part of sort of the educational freedom of the parents. So, even in that respect, I think plurality and freedom is quite a precious achievement, which should have a lot of potential and possibilities. Should be allowed.
I think that is just very, very general and will not in the end help anybody to make any law.
You're saying it should. I mean, I think I agree with Stefan. You're saying it places limits, but it doesn't. It's proscriptive and not prescriptive, basically, is what the government should do on those issues.
Exactly. Only when something becomes really problematic and clear, then this is something where the government has to enter and say, no, this mustn't be made.
Yeah.
But otherwise, parents have such a wide range of possibilities as part of the education process as well.
But
only in an idealized sense. I mean, we have huge problems with racism, sexism, etc., that are permeating our educational processes as well. All of the prejudices that we have are being played out at an educational level, and we were part of that, and we grew up through part of that. And how could we expect that somehow we could have control over those aspects of it, and that somehow we would have a benevolent? And by the way, I'm very pro public education. This is not at all. I was state educated all the way through to even I don't know if my last degree was, but certainly in grade school and secondary school and in my first years of university, I went to state universities. I believe strongly in state education, but it's not perfect. And so what would be how could you develop safeguards against what are already flawed systems? And how could you trust a system not to have these endemic levels of various isms?
Although it's interesting because I would say that certainly these days, or in the British education system, I totally agree with you about state education.
Yeah.
It actually, the imbibing of those isms comes mostly from peer-to-peer interaction and peer-to-peer and child-to-parent, and actually the institutions, the education institutions are working against those prejudices. They're actually...
That's certainly not the case in rural Alaska.
I'm very sure that's true. And it wasn't particularly the case for my education, but speaking to my friends who have kids who are at school now, and they are... I mean, the liberal agenda is very much fed to them, which obviously I agree with. But
one example, sort of, when it comes to practical consequences, and Volker, you were asking, you said I'm too open to vague. Practical example: we've got some technology. Which in the UK it's legitimate. To have child with 3 biological parents. The only legal option is when mothers or potential mothers have a mitochondrial disease. That's the only time when they can use that technology, whereby you have simply have one egg cell. And take another egg cell, you remove the nucleus from both and enter the one nucleus from the one into the other, and then you fertilize it. And that works really well. And now we can imagine either a lesbian couple or like 2 women and a man who said, no, we love each other. We want to stay together. We've got a technology which works. And only our Christian heritage doesn't allow us to use that technology. We want to use that technology and have biologically related offspring. We love each other. We are nearly like a traditional couple, a traditional family, because parents, biologically related offspring. We want to get married. Why should the state forbid such an arrangement to be legalized? They shouldn't. Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, but that of course is it will just go that way. So imagine the possibility that like 25 years ago, whatever, a gay couple would marry. In many nations that is unthinkable. Now, of course, it's very, very thinkable and totally okay in many societies and others not. And so that will inevitably happen.
In Colombia, there was already the possibility of 3 men getting married.
Okay,
one example.
Really?
And of course, then speaking about marriage arrangements, of course, in many societies you can have multiple partners whom you can marry. Polyandry. You can be a woman, marry several men. You can have polygyny, be a man, marry several women, and that is just a little bit of an extension. that the law will allow that. But of course, we find that rather unpalatable in the so-called Western societies, which I think was actually driven by the idea that you didn't want to have clans. So if you have these like big genetic clusters of families, they will constitute a threat to the state, and you want to split your society into manageable little bits, which are monogamous families, nuclear families, because they can be easier to control, to manipulate, and so that's why in Utah, when the Mormons had the polygynous system and wanted to join the United States, they had to abandon that. And so that's called the socially imposed monogamy, which is actually a very good political tool to make sure you don't get all these like forces within society who will then always pursue their own interests, and you would rather you would rather castrate the state. So that's why you want to have monogamy.
But I would have thought sort of in the
One of the
Western
theories why.
I would have thought sort of in the Western tradition it was part of the Christian natural law understanding, according to which the genitals have one purpose, and if this purpose is not used, and the purpose is reproduction, then it's an abuse, it's unnatural.
But it has nothing
the
to do
only
with
natural use is for one man having sex with one woman for reproductive purposes. And
no, that wasn't the case at all. Charlemagne, one of the big so-called godfathers of Christianity, had hundreds of women. So that was totally sanctioned by Christian society. So that depends.
After Thomas Aquinas, with the natural law sort of culture that established that.
But I think we are veering off a little bit into so to go back to our actual topic of
well, on that topic, I think I've
wanted
got
to go
something
into
to say.
agricultural revolution.
I think there's a reason that what you suggest about the mitochondrial DNA and the three parents seems there isn't an instinctive reaction against it, because it's still allowing the randomness of nature to happen. And I think it's as soon as one starts engineering what one's offspring is that people have a not necessarily justified but reaction against it. So that's why I do believe that what you're suggesting is going to happen, because it's hard to see a reason not to. It doesn't feel like playing God in the way that people would say other sorts of genetic engineering are. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's. I think that's a very good point. Yeah, but again, I mean, we are at that very difficult crossroads, and as I tried to point out, I don't think it will ever end. So let's say you are lawmakers, and now suddenly they tell you about whatever prenatal diagnostics, and you weigh the arguments, and you have endless debates, and ultimately you arrive and you make some law. By that time, there are already like 15 new developments where you haven't even caught up, and you haven't even thought about, and so there will be this steamroller of constantly new technological genetic developments, and the society will be constantly surprised and challenged to even understand what's going on. And so we are living in these times which are very, very confusing for that reason, because we will be confronted with conundrums which were never there, and we have no real tool. So I predict, not like civil war, but I predict total anarchy, where suddenly you really live with, oh my God, we in Germany, we are still concerned with, I don't know whether people should be allowed to have a sixth finger, and in a state called Azerbaijandistan, suddenly they make children who have 4 legs, and should they be allowed to compete in the Olympics or so? So that is, I think, what will happen. And yeah.
What about, maybe what we need is, maybe I'm suggesting a form of social engineering, but somehow writing into this a proviso for reflection and critical thought applied to, because what feels to me is what you're describing seems quite likely. In fact, I think these scenarios also, I agree, seem that Stefan has mentioned, but if people, because everything is happening so quickly, I think what is lacking is reflection time, reflection to think about consequences, reflection to think about who is driving perhaps the biases against double three-parent children. What would be the arguments behind that? Is that due to homophobia? Is that due to sexism? Is it due to playing God? And try to have, I'm not saying to entertain the biases, but at least have discussions around it, which is what is lacking.
I think some
the
of the
critical thought of the Enlightenment values is no longer being allowed to play out.
I totally agree, but I think sometimes the problem is that these things come about as unintended consequences of other technologies. And I've been thinking, because one area of sort of the traditional science fiction transhumanism is cybernetics, and we haven't really talked about that. But if we look at where limb replacement is these days, it's astonishing how far we've come, and it's getting to the point where prosthetics are better than sort of natural limbs.
Yes.
And then what happens if an army decides, well, those are the soldiers
Yes.
I want?
Of course they want that.
Yeah. But we've already got the technology because we haven't had.
Oscar Pistorius qualified for the regular Olympics, not just the Paralympics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we don't reflect on the initial technology because it's a clear good, and then by the time we've got it and it has all these other uses, it's almost too late because it's just going to get used that way.
Okay. So how could we build in any type of? I guess we can't. I mean, maybe that's pie in the sky thinking too. But it seems to me that is what is lacking. Just even a moment to breathe and reflect upon it.
But then you are naive, because the argument is typically, oh my God, we are now really banning this and thinking about it, and the other nations.
I'm not saying banning it. I'm saying considering.
Well, we are considering. While you're considering, you're wasting time, because there will be
maybe not, because maybe there's deleterious effects from going with this. So maybe I'm actually making the more prudent choice of being able to observe.
Yeah, you could say that, but I believe that. Well, you say that, but I believe that, of course, that's not going to happen, because the selfishness of money making will just lead to that being farmed out to some other place.
To more risky behavior.
Yeah.
With people
So the mighty nation of Swaziland will suddenly allow all the technologies to take place because they want to be the Silicon Valley of Africa.
Another option is what people are already doing. If something's forbidden in all countries, the nation states, they go to seasteading.
That's
to
what I mean.
Where
absolutely.
they have no legal boundaries.
I think if they're not doing it, the talk I was at was heavily implied that very soon, if not actually in the present, there will be portions of human brains in pigs. Very soon.
The best example is sort of human-animal hybrids is a wonderful example, because it sort of started off with the UK. They were allowed to create them, and they to develop 14 days. Then in the US, we've had human-animal hybrids, human-pig hybrids developing 28 days, and now Japan has actually legalized for them to get born. Yes. Why? And the reason for that actually was they wanted to replace, I think it was lungs, sort of the genes related to lungs into the pigs, and to have sort of the possibilities for xenotransplantation. I mean, if it worked, I mean, if we kill pigs for eating, for consumption, then it's legitimate to kill them for xenotransplantation as well.
And there is that whole topic which we haven't touched upon, and that's the topic of personhood, whether only humans have personhood. So how is that at one point? We touched upon, like, of course, the machines at one point perhaps having what we would call consciousness, and then would they be people, would they be persons, would they have to have rights? So how is that with the pig who has, let's just say, a human brain? Is that still a pig? Anyway, why should animals be allowed to be killed because we can use them and so on? So that is a whole big debate, which is, of course, connected to all of that.
Exactly, and this is sort of one example, because often many critics of transhumanism claim, well, this is a type of hyperhumanism. Now, isn't it still the same kind of development where humans, it's only about enhancement of humans and so on? But that's not the case, because, I mean, this is part of, that's what most transhumanists at least share. they claim personhood for non-human animals. And in contrast, no. We would have to move away from that speciesist self-understanding that we humans, as the only ones possessing a divine spark, we're the only ones who should have deserved personhood. No, we need to expand that. We need to move away from that understanding and take into consideration morally relevant capacities, and particularly the capacity of suffering. And that has.
It's gaining ground, that view. I heard someone in England is pushing to have the feelings of sort of dogs considered in divorce proceedings, which doesn't seem unreasonable to me.
No, it's good. It's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, but it's interesting that's coming from transhumanism, because one often thinks of someone not involved in the movement that it's actually would be the opposite. But that's quite heartening. But that's.
I mean, they big conferences on that topic. It invited Peter Singer also as, that is generally shared. But that's a logical consequence also of sort of that revised self-understanding of human beings. We are no longer the ones, just created by God, but we are part of the result of evolutionary processes, and we do have special capacities, but not the special capacities related, immaterial ones. But so do other animals have special capacities. There are vampire bats in South America who can live on the basis of blood only. That's also a special capacity. So that's not a justification for for us being the only ones who should reserve personhood.
I do find it interesting, and this wouldn't necessarily be transhumanist, but I do find a lot of the discourse interesting amongst secular humanists, which privilege the human above so many other animals, and assume they're not using the word divine spark, but they might as well be when they talk about the extreme human exceptionalism of how, and this does have a little bit of discourse in transhumanist stuff as well. But like Bex, I'm pleased that it is also from what I've read recently as well, that there seems more discussion of ourselves as another animal who is special and like other special animals. So, but because to me, the divine spark, even if it's not called divine spark, is problematic because it implies soul. Personally, I'm technically not an atheist myself, but I'm a materialist who believes in arguing in materialist forms, and I find it troubling that people would use like humanity, an essence of humanity, in a scientific argument. I find that deeply problematic. And it seems a lot of transhumanists, this idea of transcendence, of something immutable that you cannot touch, you cannot describe, this is a soul that is being described.
How strongly that is part of all culture still, as a relict of our traditional sort of Christian tradition. And we find, there are hardly any exceptions on a constitutional level. In most constitutions all over the world, it's only human beings who receive legal personhood. In Germany, for example, it's claimed, animals are no things, but legally they're supposed to be treated like things. And wherever that shows up, this is still sort of the traditional separation, us humans as having been created by gods and the others as being merely natural beings. And luckily there are many movements all over the world where this gets altered. For example, there was in Argentina now, I think it was an orangutan who received legal personhood and as a consequence had to be freed from the zoo. And this is why there's such a strong reaction to transhumanism and related movements because it's a break away from our 2,000-year-old Western traditions. All these foundations with our human exceptionalism is being altered, and that has paradigm-shifting consequences in all aspects of our life world, basically.
Let me go back to that question of essentialism. So I think that's, of course, at the heart of that self-perceived exceptionalism. So what Kathleen also mentioned, so the idea that there is an immutable kernel inside us. And of course that's then originally tied to the idea that there is an essence which is sort of the Platonic embodiment of an idea. There is a rosehood and there's a humanhood, there is a pighood. And so these categories are real, they exist in reality instead of just being conventions. And so the transhumanism, interestingly, has that corrosive acid in it to actually eat away on that idea of that essence, because it would question that such essence was ever there in evolutionary theory. How can it be that before humans came about, that there was the essence of a soul, and at which point was there a early human mother who didn't have a soul, who now suddenly gave birth to a child that had a soul? Because you can, or can you? You cannot have like a little bit of a soul. That's a big discussion. Some people would say yes.
Jane Goodall believes that chimpanzees have souls,
Jane
doesn't
Goodall
she?
is a very good person, but not a good philosopher. But so anyway, and then of course once we have these type specimens of humans, you and me and you, then we look at each other and we think, well, yeah, I mean, that person clearly must have an inner kernel which makes him or her a human. But evolutionary theory, of course, has always questioned that. And now, of course, that is my interesting question, or not my interesting question, the question I'm interested in. So how is that when we now move into the cybernetic cyborg world? Are we actually consciously... are we conscious about the fact that that will also dilute and corrode that essence of a human?
I mean, my understanding of current physics theory is that it's not a widely accepted but a legitimate theory within it that consciousness is a fundamental property of matter, and that there might be a fragment of consciousness that even an atom has, at which point, I
think for that we would need a physicist. So that sounds like having read 2 pages in this. What was it? What you read? The scientific.
My Cosmopolitan, my New Scientist.
But I think the reason. But to return to sort of the idea of corroding boundaries, I think that's why people have problems sometimes with transhuman things, is that it falls into the uncanny valley when we're exactly between the categories that we've accepted for so long, and things aren't quite as we expect them to be. And because I think people do have there's quite a visceral reaction against transhuman things. I mean, you must have encountered it, Stefan, in your work.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, sort of these traditional dualities get twisted. We've had that very simple understanding that we've got an immaterial soul, rational soul, rationality. That led also to sort of sexes and races. Of course, rationality is the male quality, and the body is connected with the female, the material of a lower value, obviously, because only the reason comes from God. And now, once we move away from that understanding, sort of all these traditional categories need to be rethought. And that has sort of, it was easy. We have sort of the male and the female in natural law being responsible for reproduction, and now we disentangle sexuality from reproduction. And that's one of the major sort of driving of technologies. It started with obviously the condoms, but now and the pill, and it moves away with now having the possibility of parents with children with 3 biological parents. We've got in vitro fertilization. We've got a pluralization of possibilities of reproduction.
But you could also argue in humans, at least, because of the fact that females are sexually receptive throughout their entire cycle, that it's been going on for a long time for human females, because we can have sex all the way. We don't just have sex when we're in heat or on heat, as the British say, or actually it's not even the technical term for human. I'm using an animal term, but because of that, and because also when women breastfeed, it functions as a natural prophylactic as well. So we have naturally, with air quote marks, is for the been practicing kind of forms of prophylactics probably fairly early on. I don't know whether other great apes, well, yeah, they do. They also, when they breastfeed, they do not ovulate regularly. So it's also a prophylactic there too. So in a sense, the females, anyway, of the species have been able to to separate reproduction from sexuality, particularly with human females who continue to have sex, as I understand some chimpanzees even continue to have sex
And
non-reproductively
I think
as well.
it's a specifically Christian idea that sex and reproduction must be linked. You won't find it in most other religions. I mean,
Certainly Catholic. I was brought up
Yeah.
Catholic.
Catholic in
so,
particular.
yeah, like in Judaism, you're one of the ways you can sanctify the Sabbath is by having a good shag. And the idea of sex for pleasure, obviously, is all throughout classical cultures. So yeah, I think it's almost returning to an earlier form of conceptualization of that kind of thing, rather than a breaking ground on an entirely new one that's happening right now.
Yeah, very clearly in non-human animals, most sex is not leading to reproduction, and sex is the ultimate social tool to manipulate others, to make them believe certain things, to make them give up resources.
Yeah.
So that is, of course, a spectrum. So there is sex for reproduction, but most sex doesn't lead to reproduction, and most sex is not, in quotation marks, intended to lead to reproduction. So you use it as a weapon or as a sweetener or something like
Tool.
that. As a tool.
And as a consequence, also, we're moving away from that binary understanding of genders, of sexuality. To
surely.
pluralization of we've got. I mean, we're not interested. It's traditions of heterosexuality, as if every man was interested in any kind of women. To reduce everything just to the aspect of our reproductive organs, it's just such a limited way of talking about sexuality. It's usually a sort of a relationship of affects. We're interested in how someone else talks about things, whether someone can lift an eyebrow, what someone is interested in. This is what drives sexuality, erotic relationships. No.
I'm not sure that's the case with sexual orientation. I think that can be quite focused on the sort of binary, just because it does obviously is quite concerned with genitals. But I think it varies from person to person, and we're understanding that there's a wider variety of ways of being attracted.
Yeah, but for me again, that is the interesting horizon of transhumanism, that all these concepts which we are now let's say in a liberal Western world promote as part of diversity, whether it is transsexuality or homosexuality or bisexuality or orgy-like behaviors or non-reproductive sex, that's all found in non-human animals. So the narrowing of these horizons were part of a socio-political process. And we are, I believe, only really able to kind of grasp that a little bit in our Christian kind of context, where we are all brought up with still. But that fluidity is really a part of natural evolution, and evolution doesn't produce unflexible types, but evolution per se produces diversity.
Behaviorally also.
Behaviorally and genetically, yeah.
Yes.
And so that is a big change away from how biology was perceived in the 1950s, 1960s.
But that's problematic, though, because there is also there's a conflation between sex and gender that is current, is between sexual orientation and gender, which is a political movement which is conflated, which actually is also something we accept, but has not actually potentially been as someone who studied, like yourself, quite a lot about sexual orientation, it's interesting that often all the papers like to bring sex, biological sex into it, when actually a lot of the results show that because we essentialize sex, not gender, but biological, to such a great degree, we may be imposing our views about biological sex onto sexual orientation itself, which I think is quite interesting. So rather than, so that means we have a lot of, from this, some of the research we did, it seems like we essentialize male, female, sex and behavior the most out of anything. Volker and I worked on a paper together. It was the subject part of my PhD thesis. And that to me, but we then impose that on sexual orientation, which I think is possibly problematic to impose our gender assumptions about gender onto sexual orientation, which is about, in essence, a sex drive and genitals. So, I mean, I also don't believe in concrete sexual orientations, so I'm in agreement with you. I don't believe in a heterosexual or a bisexual or a homosexual. I think things are much, but that's about sexual orientation. But then people immediately also want to then throw in biological sex, which I think personally are different discussions, but they have been conflated politically.
And again, then I believe that a lot of these words which we are using are just words which are convenient for us and necessary to make sense of the world.
Yeah.
So they are inventions of our need to somehow communicate, and
Absolutely.
I can't really believe that sex or gender, like that sounds really strange from a biologist's point of view. There is no sex and gender in biology unless I talk about it. So that is not...
It's a solipsistic view
Well,
of...
well, I'm not sure. So we need to make sense of, or we want to make sense of what is around us, and then we start to categorize the
But there is
the
a
world.
material reality which we're reflecting in our language. I mean, we are...
But which?
Well, the fact that we, as a sexually dimorphic species, rely on sexual reproduction involving two sexes to reproduce ourselves. That's a reality. That's not just an artifact of language.
And that's more prominent in mammals than it is, say, in reptiles, which can be having to do with temperature as well. So people take a little bit of science these days and then use it to kind of... without applying critical thought sometimes to the processes of what, for example, what Bex is talking about right now. The material reality is that humans are as a mammal species are canalized into two separate sexes. I believe in wide-ranging gender. I absolutely do, and I believe it's gender that shackles us.
Yeah.
But it's okay to say, I think, and I don't think it's particularly problematic to just acknowledge the material reality of two. Now, that could well be transformed, and under transhumanism may well be. And maybe really interesting, exciting stuff, too, if we were able at some point being able to do stuff at a very chromosomal level.
Yeah, I'd love to experience life embodied as a male. I think that would be amazing.
But let's say you would perhaps then conceptualize yourself as being smack in the middle of some normal distribution of creatures we call women or something like that, yeah? And that, of course, would also have fuzzy edges in biology also, because clearly we would then use the word intersex or something like that. And you can't really...
But there's no, in biology, intersex humans are still canalized into male or female. And that's why we don't have what the technical biological term, which is not the human term, is a true hermaphrodite amongst mammals, is because humans can't self-fertilize in that way. You cannot be able, you can, if you're intersex, have offspring, but you cannot have it both as a female or a male.
But I think there was a animal who can, no?
Oh, no,
recently there was...
there are many.
No, there's
many,
multiple
which
animals, but they are not mammals.
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
not mammals.
Okay, yeah.
And that's my point, is that, so there is a certain, but I think that's why I do have to say I find transhumanism exciting for that reason.
Yeah.
That if one is able to transcend what maybe, I also would consider the shackling influence of biology, that is quite interesting to me.
And that will break the shackles of gender as well, if one were able to change one's embodiment.
Yeah, but then, I mean, where do you want to stop? You would say, oh yeah, I mean, I'm a mammal. So now as soon as you would say I'm a vertebrate or I'm belonging to what is loosely called animals, then of course you would have, again, a very wide distribution of possibilities, including self-fertilization.
However, I am a mammal, which means that I am
so you
canalized
believe
into
there
one or two at the moment.
And you believe there is such a thing living as a mammal?
I believe there are organisms that nurse their young. There's going to be small bumpy bits. There are going to be some of those mammals that don't always, there's going to be exceptions, tiny exceptions, which do not follow the rules of what we have classified as a mammal or a reptile or a fish. I am a person, as you know this anyway, who believes in similarist thinking, so I would prefer to think of us all as one, this is why I said I wasn't an atheist earlier, as one connected panentheistic whole, a holism that includes all of organisms together, and I would prefer to look for patterns that link us rather than separate us. So no, I would be happy not thinking of myself as a mammal. I am also a person who believes in material reality, but my brain, and this is where the transhumanists would go, my brain is open to thinking of myself as part of a fish, part of this crazy little spaceship in the cosmos. I'm part, I'm carbon. I'm wearing a bit of gold from a star.
Yeah.
I'm connected to it, or I would like to think of myself.
The categories are artificial and imposed, but,
Yes.
but the criterion on which we define the categories aren't. They're
I'm not
inherent
sure.
in the organisms.
No,
I would say.
I would dispute that, but because I believe we cannot get out of that circle of, which is basically a circle. So in order to talk, we need categories, and as soon as we do, then we believe that they must be real, or the criteria must be real. So in that sense, I'm actually more of a really crazy social anthropologist or a postmodernist. It's all a discourse somehow.
I can't bear postmodernism.
Yeah.
I haven't been able
So
to.
I have been in a department which is an anthropology department, and of course I was a hardcore biological anthropologist, not a determinist. And then there are these social anthropologists where everything is, relativistic. But I have taken that on board as a very enriching perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, language really is an issue, or is a problem, and because it's not a solution we can solve easily, because sort of our language, which we established, has metaphysical connotations. So basically, a specific understanding of the world is implicit in the language we're using, and we have to use it because it's established. So it's difficult also to get out of this frame of mind which we've shared for a long time. I mean, sort of with technology, when we talk about technology and humans, there's something, technology is a means, and sometimes technology is a means and can be meaningfully analyzed in this way. Otherwise, technology is altering who we are, and this is also the case. And we seem to be forced to making a distinction between the two, but no, both is true. No, and that's sort of, that's a challenge of the language, which we've inherited. No,
I don't think we can only obviously see the world, understand the world through the prism of our language. But what I believe is that underneath our feeble understanding is an actual reality which we fumble towards. Not that all reality is constructed discursively. I don't accept that.
Yeah, that then is the deep philosophical quagmire. Is there reality? Is it underlying? I mean, these are all things where I have become rather humble, unless I drink a lot, and then I will also talk like that.
I think the reason that I rebel so strongly against that kind of view is that it seems to be an abdication of moral responsibility and moral decision making, which I think is crucial at a time like this when we are having so many fundamental moral choices to make.
There we could get together. So while, of course, I would perhaps not ascribe to the underlying reality somehow, but I also experience myself as a human who is a social being together with others, and somehow I want to make sure that you're not like cutting my throat because you don't like my argument.
I won't do it while we're being recorded. I promise you that much.
But then from where do I possibly take my moral guidance, because it would be much easier to slit your throat and I can have it my way. So, and of course there have been many times in human history where that was the way to do it. So now how do we arrive at any sort of value which will last for a while? And that brings me back to that problem which I tried to point out, with developments being so fast, we will be constantly paying catch-up, whereas let's say when developments weren't that fast, maybe for 500 years you could have some sort of rather rigid societal structure. And So I want to be open to new developments. I don't want to sound as if I'm a conservative. And I really don't know how I will do it because I will constantly be asked also, all right, to be an expert. So who am I to really judge stuff on the latest genetics developments or the latest technological developments? And who should?
Yeah, and our moral understanding is evolving. I mean, look, at the personhood of animals is a particularly good example of that, which would have been an absurdity 50 years ago, 40 years ago. I mean, I can't... So, yeah.
Yeah, except in other cultures, of course, there has always been the idea of birth control, other times, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't have an answer.
I mean, it's falling back a bit to material reality, but because people are evolved to be generally cooperative. I figure chances are quite good if I go down in a bunker with people that generally, I don't remember statistically, that I have about 80-90% chance of them being decent people who won't slit my throat to bring it back to that. And therefore, I mean, it's a little bit of a wager because, I mean, you might not know everyone, but it's a pretty good one. I mean, chances are good that I'll walk out of here.
The chances are good none of us are a sociopath?
Well, we assume that. Some of us could be very, very good at
But I'm not wanting to be too cynical, but we really have to remember that like 70 years ago, I mean, our throats may have been slit in this bunker.
God. Of course.
And so we had that great privilege in our generation of living in a time, because we grew up in these often now sort of vilified Western societies, that we experienced a time when pretty much we were allowed to think what we want to think and also say it. And the consequences that we will be killed or imprisoned are rather minute.
I think I'm constantly aware of that. As a gay Jewish woman, I think it'd be hard not to be constantly aware of how incredibly lucky I am.
Yes, we are very
to be alive
lucky
now.
And we are very lucky that we were born at a certain time. And that is, of course, not due, or that we sit here and have some sort of educated discussion. That's not because we are particularly smart people. We just happen to be born into a good state school system, like in Germany or whatever.
And Alaska had the money rolling in the 70s, which meant I got a good education because of the oil money, in all honesty.
So we are lucky data points.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
So I want to stress actually many things which are already possible. We are not allowed to do yet. I mean, obviously, we live in wonderful times in comparison to his historical past.
Let's. But the oppressive sort of man speaks. So what?
I'm sort of what I mentioned.
Man. Sorry,
sort of the incest example. Incest is illegal in Germany. Incest among consenting adults. There is no good reason for it. If there are competent adults being involved, I think it's. For example, that's one example. We've had the possibility of selecting a fertilized egg after in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. There was a case in Germany, and the reason they tried to, they reformulated. It used to be forbidden. Then it went to court, and there was a need to make a new decision. And then they regulated. We don't want. We need to prevent handicap from being stigmatized, and that's very important. That's a very important aim. And then they came to a new regulation, which basically said, okay, in selecting fertilized egg after in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is illegal, but you're allowed to do it if there's a high risk genetically in the parents of the child being mentally handicapped. And I'm saying, Cohen, this reinforces the stigmatization of the people with a handicap. As a much better counter solution, it would be parents in the same way as parents have the right to choose a partner for reproductive purposes. They should have the right to select a fertilized egg after IVF and PGD, because it's the same kind of selection procedure. In both cases, you're making some you have some predeterminations, but no one is fully predetermined because of the epigenetic processes. And so I think these are again two parallel processes which should be treated analogously or also in a moral sense.
It's fascinating because, for example, in many societies, colorism is very strong. If you could select to have the palest of the potential offspring, you would end up with a lot of societies whitening themselves, and I don't think we'd want that. But it's hard.
Well, if you live in Germany, yes, I don't want people looking like me for sure.
But in I believe in there are Asian societies where that's the case as well, where parents who would choose to have the palest skinned baby they could, and I don't think we'd want that. But then how do you not allow that and allow the other? I mean, I don't know where you draw the line.
In the U.S., you definitely can choose the sex. It's legal to choose the sex of the baby.
But only for family balancing reasons. So if you've got 6 girls and say we want a boy now, then that is a legitimate option.
Okay.
And also the possibility, for example, of savior siblings.
Yes, that's quite a weird one as well.
That is an interesting
case, no?
Yeah. As a writer, I'd spent a lot of time thinking about what it would be like to be that sibling.
You're an only child,
and I'm an only child. Yeah,
I've got loads of siblings. But recently, my mother had some bone graft. In fact, we're waiting to see whether it takes because she broke a limb and then wasn't healing. So then she had the bone from her femur put in. And then I was thinking, what's the next? You just start to think like, what's the next step after that? Is first degree relative. Obviously, I'll say it on tape. I'd be happy to give my bone marrow from my mother. Because I am 50% related to my mother,
yes.
But I do it because she's a lovely person. But suddenly it became it stepped out of theory for me into something quite personal that hopefully will not be the case in 3 or 4 months. But I also, it's not, for me, who is not an only child, there are 3 others who also could do that too. And she's got 3 living siblings also. So it's not quite, it's interesting to me, just as a person who's from a huge family. When one is an only child, you don't have as many options.
True.
You have to actually be more pseudo-altruistic in that case.
But there's a difference between
kin selection.
I now exist, and it turns out I can be useful to a relative, and I was created to be useful to this relative.
Yeah.
I mean, Stefan, what's your feeling on savior siblings?
It is a tricky case, actually. But in the end, and I'm not a utilitarian thinker, but here, actually, sort of, this is my reflections would be quite utilitarian, in the sense that, in the end, if sort of the risk associated to a kidney transplantation, they are not so big. You can live very well with just 1 kidney, and in the end, you've got 2 healthy children instead of 1.
I'm sure that child would be I guess I'm with Stefan. I think the child would be very loved, the second child also. So it has caused me some thoughts about this over the years, but I don't think it's necessarily ethically wrong.
I don't know what I think. I'm very torn about it.
That just makes me think about generational kin selection and reading some stuff about transhumanism of cryogenics, where people say, well, I'll wake up, in 400 years and my kin will take care of me. And it made me think also about like diluted kin selection. I've thought of this for a while, that once you get past like generation 3 or 4 and you're going to 12.5% of your genetic relatedness to generation 4, and then getting diluted after that under some arguments in evolutionary theory, Hamilton, you would be less related to someone 400 years ago. And I actually think this may be a problem with how humans conceive of the future anyway. We're concerned potentially about our grandchildren, who would be 25% related to us. But as it gets more diluted, it becomes more abstract. And that might be... that may or may not be something from our brains that doesn't allow us to conceive, because it's not natural, again with air quotes, to conceive that many generations into the future. But we need to, in order to save our planet at the moment, we are going to have to trick ourselves into thinking of them as closely related kin.
We are, and we are, and sort of people sort of normally stress the differences, but in the end, no, you know, with apes, I don't know, depending on the calculation, 98% identical genes, you know, and with other, you know, animals, it's always a high percentage. There's much more which connects us to the others than what separates us.
Yes.
And
yeah, that's what I mean by similarist. But we'd have to shift to that kind of mode.
Exactly.
Do you have any ideas how to do that?
Wow. Advertisement. No, it is the way we talk about it. No, we talk about it. We enter into public discussions, participate in events. We write literature in order to stress it. That's how things. It's not one person who can change it. You know.
And we do have a fantastic capacity for empathy. I mean, the fact that we care about non-human animals is already extraordinary, I think. The fact that, you know, I care so much for my cats is absurd, but also, I think, hopeful, because it suggests that one can trigger those things to care about future generations, to care about the world.
I'm very skeptical about that. You care about your cat as long as you have enough food to share with your cat, and the first and if a crisis would come about, then our deeply selfish existence will immediately come to the fore.
I wouldn't eat my cat.
But you would let your cat starve? Maybe not. Okay, you could. I could perceive. I could perceive that many humans would still feed their pet and starve themselves. That's fine. But if we would come to the point. Oh my God, you know, all these alleged unrelated others are in fact really very closely related to me, and the world is one and humanity is one. I think that is just a veneer which will very quickly break down as soon as there will be conflicts over resources, and we will all hunker down in our little villages and bunkers and we'll hope that somehow, when we emerge again, that there are fewer others out there and we are the lucky ones. So I don't trust at all that makes any difference.
Yes,
you may be right.
However, we just to see sort of the general developments, it's not so bad all over the place. I mean, in comparison to 200 years ago, 200 years ago, we've had an absolute poverty in Europe of 80%. People like at the age of 7, people were the average life expectancy was 40 years. Now, in the past 200 years, now with technological, scientific innovations, we've had the average life expectancy of 80 years. We've got an absolute poverty rate on a global level of 10%. Really? You know, there are many good aspects associated with these new technologies. That's why that's why I'm trying. What I'm trying to make the people aware of that. I'm not arguing with your former description, but sort of by means of technologies we can find a lot of goods.
Yes, but that is exactly the problem, that resources are finite, and the last 200 years have enabled us, because of technologies, to extract more and more resources from the planet, which made us live longer, which made humans to multiply, and many more humans being healthy, living a long life. But that is a totally unsustainable situation, and it will not, and we are now approaching the end game, because the resources which 9 billion people need will inevitably mean that these resources will very quickly not be available anymore. And and we had these 200 years of being lucky in that sense, that that the proportion of humans who can live a good life were able to do that. They will not be able to do that anymore in 150 years.
I'm not a futurologist. I can't predict the future, but sort of, I mean, that's why I find it hard making such predictions. I think we sort of, there are very good technological innovations which are quite promising, like in vitro meat. It's a way, we don't have to kill the animals, we don't have to have the mass farming. Antibiotics need to be given to them. They again cause antibiotic-resistant cells. That has consequences for climate change, CO2 emissions. And now in the future, then we'll have some nice sort of petri dishes at home, and we have wonderful piece of in vitro fillet steak without antibiotics, without animals having to be killed, which would be probably be more sustainable on a global basis as well, because the richer people get in China, in India, the more meat they want to consume, and if they consume the in vitro meat, that would be fine. I mean, so there are a lot of interesting technological innovations which could make things much more sustainable than you suggest.
Okay, let's say that for the last 200 years we didn't really have to think about the sustainability, because it was still there was so much out there, fish and wood and ore and whatever, and we could just harvest that and happily consume it. And now let's say maybe there is a need coming about to actually think a bit more into the future, because whatever the fossil fuel will finish or whatever it may be, and maybe the technological advances will shift towards such so-called sustainable energies. But I work since 40 years in the tropics, and I see that really as I have never seen anything getting better in terms of being conserved. I only see real destruction in terms of biodiversity and environmental degradation, silting of rivers, people actually falling back into poverty in places in equatorial Africa, etc. So that is
the Rhine is cleaner than it was.
Pardon?
The Rhine is cleaner.
Yes,
than it was. I mean,
the Rhine is in Germany, a river. You know, but however, the river Taraba, which I mean had a lot of water until recently, is increasingly having no water, because the hills around have been denuded from trees because they are used to produce rifle butts in China. So, So I'm very pessimistic, and I'm very happy that I will be dead in statistically 32 years.
Or maybe no.
No. I will die when I'm 92 or 93, something like that.
That's the plan.
Oh no, hang on a second. I always up that. No, I'm already 65, so I will be 97. And then hopefully I will not have a cosmic memory, and I will not know about anything that's going on, but be happily dead and just like.
You would prefer to be uninformed.
I want to be an uninformed dead, post-human. We have talked for almost 2 hours. Should we should I just throw in some of the keywords which we had, and maybe and then I may say, oh yeah, right, that's what I also wanted to say. So we had the upgrading, we had the superwomen, Superman, we had the unembodied consciousness, there was the idea of opting in, opting out, given the new developments, xenotransplantation, cybernetics, colorism and other discriminatory concepts, whether or not we can perceive ourselves as being related to those who are actually others, whether it's a dystopia, what will happen in the future. There is hyperhumanism. These were the topics we touched upon. So is there anything very close to our heart where what I also like is there is the silicon-based transhumanism and carbon-based transhumanism. Yeah. So where do we still feel our curiosity hasn't been satisfied?
I mean, I am quite interested in the futurology questions of where we are going to be with these things. What are the options going to be available to us in 10 or 20 years' time? And I'm probably not well enough informed to know. I don't know if it's something you could answer, Stefan, or you just don't think it's possible to know.
No, I don't like to make predictions. I'm like it's sort of the 30, 50 years prediction based, even on empirical stuff. I find it really. I think it's pseudoscientific to do so.
Yeah, it would be pseudoscientific. But then, what about that tension?
But then I'm a fiction writer. So
All right.
As a fiction writer, that's perfect. That's your job.
I suppose. Sorry, good. No, carry on.
what sort of I like doing? No, but I like to being confronted with the fictions and to give inspiration for contemporary challenges. That's actually there's someone who's collecting loads of science fiction stories, and recently they entered all of them into the database, and now they're like companies approaching him in order they want to invent a new, I don't know, dry cleaner, it's something, and so then he pays them to sort of enter that term into the database and to get inspiration for future inventions.
That's wonderful.
And yeah, I think it is a wonderful way for fiction and sort of innovation to interact, and also sort of besides, I mean, science fiction, art in general. I find that highly fascinating, sort of the interaction to show new possibilities. Bioart, Eduardo Kach, who's done the Alba, the fluorescent rabbit. Well, actually, the first time I was here at the Art Biennale was, I don't know exactly, it was maybe 15 years ago, and I saw Patrizia Piccinini, and there was a sculpture I saw here, still alive with stem cells, a little girl, molding humans out of stem cells. It was a sculpture, and that really changed my.
Was it beautiful?
That was actually quite beautiful. Yeah, she also created Humphrey. I'm not sure whether Harvey, based on what would an entity have to look like. Who would survive, who would have the highest chance of surviving a car crash. And that was a sculpture based on scientific research.
Wow.
That didn't look beautiful. So the function and beauty.
No, that's true.
There was a friend of mine who genetically engineered zebra fishes. And managed to realize that in order to get some of the nutrition, 15 to 20%, based on photosynthesis, and that worked.
Wow!
And so as a consequence, these zebra fishes turned slightly green. So the little green human beings from outer space, they might actually be our future.
Well, they can count. Zebrafish, I think, have numeracy. So there's a lot of wonders about even non-mammals that are.
I mean, genetically, we're not so different with them. So if it works with them, it's a matter of further training. We could employ that on human beings, and that better than starving, turning green. It's definitely a better option, huh? Or we might need that on Mars missions in the future.
Yeah.
It's more direct. It's more direct. I suppose there's that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I suppose what interests me in one of the current projects I'm working on is I'm scripting for the Amazon Prime TV show, which will be on sometime next year or the year after, called The Power, which is about. It's based on a feminist sci-fi novel in which women, by Naomi Alderman, in which women spontaneously across the world start developing the power to electrocute people. They basically develop an organ like the one inside electric eels. And the point of this, as she wrote it, was to change the power balance in terms of raw physical power between men and women, and then imagine what would happen to society on that basis. And I think that's what's fascinating about all these things. You can make one little change, and then I think the social changes that will flow from it could be huge, and I think unpredictable, but fascinating.
Can I throw in a primatological version of that? Well, then I had been taught by Volker, so I'm sure it's Volker's example in the first place, just to give him due credit. But you could also argue with the bonobos, who are so, then they can obviously interbreed with common chimpanzees, etc. But the bonobos, which have a matriarchal structure, or someone would say co-dominant structure, the females have quite a lot of power through coalitions, and because they organize together against males who try to to be patriarchal, which is actually what happens with the more patriarchal chimpanzees. But they think that one of the reasons to do with this is, which is under something called behavioral ecology, is because of the division of the Congo River. Volker, please feel free to correct me for the whole world if I get this wrong. The bonobos had more were able to exploit a particular abundant food stuff, which is more leaf-based, called terrestrial herbaceous vegetation, which means therefore the females were not in high competition with each other like chimpanzees are with fruits.
Right.
Therefore, we're able to be more cooperative together and form what is a more egalitarian, if not more female-dominated society. But they are, I think 1 million to 1.5 million years separated, not very long, and yet have extraordinarily different social systems.
Fascinating.
And there has been some interbreeding between them. They found out through recent genetic, but it's mainly social systems difference. But that's how a tiny little tweak, has this huge result in us in this case, like organisms and actually evolution, not just culture, but actually adaptations also.
Which is returning to focus upon why it's troubling that we're not having the time to consider what's happening, because if each little thing could have, a butterfly effect, and there's a million little things, and who knows? I don't blame you for not wanting to make predictions, because who knows where everything's going to go.
No, it's interesting, but as a sort of philosopher, I don't want to make predictions.
Yeah.
That's simply not. I find it fascinating. I don't think actually it can be made on a scientific basis. It's just too much.
I agree with that. That harps back to that whole issue of, is there a direction? How do we know? Okay, maybe retrospectively, but looking into the future. But still, then it goes back to the point of whether or not we should try to somehow implement directional change. Or should we just leave it to what now would be whatever natural selection gone wild by humans subjecting their brains to whatever happens? Or should we actually say we want to have certain developments taking place, they are better than others? Or should we just leave it to, which is basically companies who will be able to make the most profit, and that is the direction things will take? Or should we regulate?
I think one of the issues with sort of trying to impose a direction is that we understand ourselves very poorly.
Yes.
I think a lot about mobile phones, which are effectively Star Trek communicators. We have produced Star Trek, but we're not using them to do what they're doing. We're using them to text each other. People have stopped phoning because no one predicted that. We imagine we'd have this wonderful thing and we'd be video conferencing all the time. But actually that's not what we use the technology for. So I think it's hard to force us in one direction because we react in ways we don't anticipate.
But then we may as well have the nuclear fission problem. When Lise Meitner and Otto Hahn were sitting there of splitting the atom, they just did that because that's a fantastic thing to do. They didn't have any applied ideas in mind, because that was just like a totally fascinating thing. And then, of course, what comes from it? Good stuff, bad stuff, I don't know, atomic weapons and nuclear power plants or all kind of medical implications. So I also believe, actually, it's not possible to predict what's going to happen. And to try to regulate things will always have probably more cons than pros. But then I'm not afraid about myself, but I'm very skeptical that things will not get out of hand and there will be really big unwanted consequences. But how to do something about it, don't ask me.
In any case, we do have sort of criterion at the moment for what we prefer, and these are our contingent nodal points, but they are meaningful to us. And so for example, that sort of quite much discussed risky experiment in China concerning the scientist who tried to do genetic modification, CRISPR, genome editing, to vaccinate against HIV. In the end, if that worked out, if this doesn't have any side effects, I guess most people would want that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something which...
I was quite excited about the new, again, I read it in New Scientist magazine, the new pill that they have actually not just stops genetic aging, I think it was in mice, but they think it's certainly applicable to humans, but actually reverses it recently, some combination of DHEA and metformin, I think, to stop the cancer implications. But that was very interesting to me. I think most people would be like, yeah. Why not? If there's not, I mean, in multiple arenas, like I think some aspects of transhumanism are extremely exciting and wonderful, possibly speculative, but, stuff to do with gender, stuff to do with a lot of these extensions of self are hugely exciting.
That's actually another aspect of these human-animal hybrids we talked about earlier. It's not just about xenotransplantation, but actually we now have an average, we think there's a maximum lifespan. So far it was 122 years, the French lady, and so far that seems to be the limit of a human lifespan. But that doesn't mean it has to remain like this. I mean, the turtle Harriet died at the age of 178 or something. Yeah. There are many other animals they live a couple of hundred years. Yeah. So if we found out by means of big data analysis which genes are responsible for their lifespans, and we could take them and integrate them into the human genome, and that would be something we would be interested in.
Except, obviously on an individual level, but that's the part. Level, exactly. The what's a common problem? I can't remember the fact that individually it would be great, but as a society,
tragedy of the commons.
It would be a tragedy of the commons, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, but then you're back to. Back to what you could call now actually eugenics, in terms of you should not be allowed to live longer than 120 years, because what kind of eugenics would that be? Actually, that is a
Logan's Run.
Yeah. So, don't know.
And to do with the unequal distribution as well is the other.
The unequal distribution, yeah. Why should I be allowed to have my 120 years, whereas the person in Suriname who doesn't have the resources will be, subjected to just having 56 years?
Well, we already have that type of disproportionate at the moment anyway. In terms of
yes. However, even sort of on that global level, now in the poorest countries in the world, Nigeria, they've got an average life expectancy which is higher than our life of 50 years. Yeah. I mean, it's still lower than ours, but it's higher than the life expectancy we in Europe had 200 years ago. So, or the access to HIV drugs, PrEP, it used to be, I think, only 10 years ago was like 10%. Now it's up to 45-50% on a global scale of HIV positive people have access to the drug. So I mean, it's not a perfect situation, but it's better that people have access to and have access to the drug, that the drug has gotten developed in the first place than if no one had. No, I mean, this is sort of
and I am in total agreement to that, because I think sometimes currently geopolitically the argument office is like no one should have access to many things, where I actually think it's better to have some people.
Exactly.
And economies of scale mean eventually it will become accessible to the
and we need to make sure to expand that, to be more exclusive and more people. I mean, that's our effort to do that. It's not a necessary development, that the prices will go down or that people will have access, but that's our political engagement. We need to take care of that.
One question which we haven't explained to ourselves and perhaps to the three people who listen in is why we got actually interested in transhumanism. So what was it? What sparked our particular interest in that keyword? So for me, of course, if I look back, so I was I grew up in a little village in Germany. I was always interested in animals. And then from that came my career as a behavioral researcher in animals, and particularly in monkeys and apes. And then I started to see, of course, these very, very obvious similarities between us and other primates. And then I became somehow drawn into these debates about animal rights and non-human personhood, and had to think about issues which are more philosophical issues of is there human exceptionism or not, and what are the boundaries, and so on, and also in terms of sexuality, of classifying people. So that was my career, which, however, as I should point out again, is the trans more from the evolutionary side of things until now. So I'm not really somebody who had to think much about the classic transhumanism idea, which tries to look into the future or so. Yeah. So that was my own little way to become a transhumanist. I don't know if somebody else wants to chip in there.
I think for me it was through fiction, but that's an interesting question, because it just made me realise. I first became interested in fantasy and fiction, and through that sci-fi as well, through reading a book called The God Beneath the Sea, which was a novelisation of some of the Greek myths, and actually the Greek gods and heroes are transhuman. And I think that at the centre of most of the narratives of the kinds of books I read, the heroes, the classic hero's journey, the hero in that journey is a transhuman. They are greater than other humans. They are enhanced in some way. Yeah. And I think that's how it started. And then obviously as I got older, I read the actual sort of cyberpunk and related novels, which are more explicit studies of that kind of thing. But I've always obviously as a writer, one writes about as a genre writer, I know the exceptional, and so the transhuman is sort of at the core of the kind of stuff I...
How did they get enhanced, these heroes?
Usually through heritage from the gods. Mm-hmm. They're demigods, the Greek heroes. Mm. So yeah.
They're kind of hybrid.
They're hybrids, yeah.
Even the gods in Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung are in a way post-humans. Because they're eternally strong and forceful, but they're dependent on the golden apples.
Yeah,
that's part of the story. Once Freya's golden apples are being taken away by Fasold and Fafnir, the gods age. Mm-hmm. So
I think Norse mythology is particularly fascinating because it ends in apocalypse. It's the most. Because they fall. Their lifespan is not unlimited.
And then restart.
Yeah.
In Norse.
Yeah.
I was going
maybe let's. Sorry. Yeah, I was the one who then transgressed.
Yeah.
Okay. So we had myself, then we had Bex, and now Kathleen. So what got you interested in transhumanism?
I was forbidden, essentially, not entirely, but mostly forbidden television as a child. We only had 2 channels anyway in rural Alaska. My parents were very kind of anti-TV. And so it was a very forbidden quality to me. And I think by the time I was 16 or 17, my siblings and I had an agreement where we would secretly watch Star Trek by retrieving the pliers and turning on the channel that my parents had hidden. So we all cooperated to watch forbidden television together. But due to that, my parents really encouraged reading books. And I had no censorship at all in terms of reading books, and I was talking about this publicly recently, and therefore I was allowed to imagine anything, anywhere, and I think because I was in my early teens in the 80s, I was reading a lot of like dystopic environmental science, juvenile or young adult fiction, which is what I would have been most influenced by. I think that when you are forced to imagine things just in your head, it's a different process than when you're shown them visually. And for me, I think it helped me in my own process as an artist and a filmmaker in terms of symbolic thought, and also as a writer, because I think I might have been conceiving of things in a different way that I would have if I had just been more passively the end result is I eventually did a master's in film theory because it was both a forbidden quality and also because I just loved it and I'd been forbidden it. And it was wonderful to study film in that way. The internet was very new in 1998 for the general populace, and I did my master's on something I was later to explore in my PhD studies, which was categorization of extensions of ourselves. And so for my master's, I actually looked at this human, I think I call it the human/machine dichotomy in my master's dissertation. And that to me I was very interested because it fit in with all the narratives of my teenage life, like the prosthetics that were in those young adult novels, the idea of extending oneself. And I was extremely optimistic about this all when I was 27. Also, I was just really excited about the potentials. I thought that racism will cease because of the internet, sexism will fade away because we will be able to empathize with each other. And I'm a bit more cynical about that now because I don't, and I feel optimistic about some parts of it too, but I think I was naive in the way I thought about it. So eventually I did my doctorate on how we binarize different concepts, and I looked at male-female divisions, heterosexual-homosexual divisions, human-animal divisions, and then human-machine divisions. So I continued, and I hopefully will continue my thoughts about how we binarize, and then going back to what I initially said at the beginning, and this is just a personal philosophy, how we can envelop a holism around these rather than this split. To me, that is quite important philosophically.
Yeah, the split is fundamental for me too. I mean, sort of these binaries. And I mean, I came to philosophy age 12. Heraclitus was the first. Heraclitus.
Oh, Heraclitus. Sorry. Yeah, of course. Heraclit.
From Heraclitus, there were all the sort of his aphorisms, the remains of his writing, they were commented on by Nietzsche and Plato. And so I started reading Nietzsche and Plato, and Nietzsche sort of became an educator. I'd read all of what Nietzsche wrote by the age of 20. And he presents a way of thinking, this naturalist way of thinking, non-binary understanding. There's a permanent becoming in everything, and this is what I try to employ, think through the consequences, and I realized actually the dominant philosophical traditions, they still uphold sort of that human exceptionalism, dualistic thinking, and I was confronted with a lot of challenges as a consequence of that, because these power structures are still very strong. Who uphold, no, we are the rational, only rational creatures, and then I went into applied ethical issues by being confronted within all of these debates because of the inventions of new technologies. And at the end of the 90s, there was like the Sloterdijk-Habermas debate. In Germany, Habermas and Sloterdijk, probably the most famous German living philosophers, and Sloterdijk in a presentation which was entitled "Rules on the Human Soul" said we need to think about the impact of genetic technologies. That's all he said. In the end, he played around with Nietzsche and Heidegger, and it sort of had the connotation of what do you want, as if he thought we need like political. Well, he was suggesting some really dangerous thoughts, and that's Habermas replied to that. And actually, by the way, Sloterdijk did not suggest any transhumanist ideas. Right. In the end, actually, he's so bioconservative, he's more bioconservative than Habermas. But Habermas then replied to Sloterdijk and he said, no, this is like neo-Nietzschean breeding fantasies, and that's what he wrote in one paragraph in his writings in his book on liberal eugenics, and he cited Sloterdijk without mentioning the name of Sloterdijk, just not to give him too much public attention. But this was sort of the context when he connected questions, applied ethical questions, with transhumanism and with Nietzsche's thinking. And so that's how I started to combine these elements, and I thought, no, I need to develop a proper philosophy of transhumanism, which takes all the various aspects and developments into consideration, because most of the transhumanists, who sort of public speakers, intellectuals, they have sort of this background of being, AI people, of entrepreneurs, innovators, not specialists, and not properly trained philosophers.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm basically trying to. Well, that's what I've been developing then. Yeah.
It would seem to me that Germany is the right place to be having a lot of these conversations, because Germany is going to be cautious with any concept of the Übermensch, and that a lot of the sort of Silicon Valley people are very, yeah, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, because I'm the oldest, I can at times, rein us in. So that was very interesting. So now I would like to ask a question. Which possibilities of transhumanism would we ever want to still live and experience? So stuff that actually might happen in the future, where we would actually be very curious to be part of it somehow. Is there anything like that? Could we think about, I would be very curious to still experience that. You mentioned something already, but
I can certainly say which fictional universe I would want to live in, which is Ian M. Banks' The Culture, which is the most utopian vision.
How does that work?
It's actually not a human society, but it's human-like people in our galaxy who've they've developed AI to the point that they have sentient minds who are so much more clever than humanity that they run these worlds. They're at a technological level where they're living in Dyson spheres and similar habitats. And crypto-humanity has been engineered to have drug glands, which are an internal system where they can choose to inject engineered drugs which will make you happy or sad or a bit melancholy as you watch a sad play, or allow you to sort of control your own emotions to some extent, or enhance your own experiences. But humanity itself has been, and healthy lifespans have been extended, and people can download their conscience if they choose. But in this society, people don't choose to live forever. Usually they have 300-400 year lifespans, and because everything is controlled by the machines, it's a life of complete leisure for humanity. And that's quite appealing, I think. And I think elements of it, like the longer healthy lifespan, are feasible in the nearish future, and I'd certainly be interested in that. And also, I, as a speculative fiction reader and writer, the idea of meeting a non-human intelligence remains endlessly fascinating and appealing. And whether that's a machine intelligence or an alien intelligence, or even just a modified human whose intelligence has become so different through the modification, that was something I'd love to do. So that's me.
Yes.
Okay, so if I were to take another, take another speculative fiction kind of model, I do have quite Luddite tendencies in some senses, and so probably I would choose kind of like Woman on the Edge of Time. I think it was Marge Piercy who wrote it, who kind of envisioned a cooperative eco-village where everyone's bisexual. They're doing it, the roles are based on what your abilities are. They have solved the problem, tragedy of the commons, but I don't remember how. But there's constant communication. It's very idealized. It's pretty hippie-ish. It's slightly, except for everyone being bisexual, it's slightly how I was raised. My parents are kind of back to the Landers. And that said, there are some aspects, so I have a tendency towards that, and I always appreciate the organic. But that said, there are certain elements of transhumanism I find extremely exciting, and one of them is is possibly the extension of life. I think I'd like to live maybe a couple hundred years more. I love being alive, and I've lost some people to death over the years, and I think life is so precious, and I don't think I rarely get bored. I think I would enjoy that. I think eventually I would like to die, but I'd like to be in good health for like 300, 400 years. Eventually I probably would like to die, but I think I'd really, really enjoy that. So for me, it would be, I would fall into the category of people who I think there's some benefits we can get from this, and I think there are some dangers, and I think I would be excited about extension of life possibilities.
Yeah, this is something, I agree with both of you. So the health span, expanded health span is something which is, I'm very interested in on a very individual level, but also for, the others. That seems to be a realistic option given the various technologies we discussed. I don't think sort of the people, transhumanists who mention immortality and mean it in a literal sense, I don't think that's absolutely ridiculous. It cannot even be conceptualized. Sort of once the entire universe either comes to a standstill, the expansion, or comes to a cosmological heat death, then we are dead. I'm sorry, give up the notion of immortality.
Absolutely, yeah.
But a radical expansion of a health span, that's a wonderful, wonderful achievement. That's a wonderful direction, a goal. Then definitely something sort of a plurality which needs to get promoted. Sort of less paternalism in society. That's sort of where the institutions tell you what you have to do. That's something, a direction which I think needs to be promoted much further. We've already achieved quite a bit, but there is still potential for more. And the third, I think, important achievement or direction which I would love to experience is sort of to have technologies for a sustainable future. To take care of the challenges concerning, climate change and so on. And I think there is a lot of potential in that. And because it's not just something which technologies cannot only be applied to us as humans, but also to, used to change the circumstances, the conditions we live in. And it's always an interaction between our capacities and the environment which promote the human flourishing. And I think that's a fundamental aspect to reflect upon and consider.
I think I would be interested to see what a post-scarcity human society could look like.
You guys can both come live with me in my eco-village in 400 years when we're all still alive, except for Volker, who wants to die at 92.
Yes, I have 97.
We can reanimate your corpse.
97. I also had, it's interesting, the extended lifespan, I discussed with friends quite recently, and how long would we like to live, and we all regretted that. These are all like guys my age, sort of, 60s, 70s, and academics, and so we really regret that our curiosity, which we have maintained, we haven't been able to even start studying all the stuff which we want to. I have never read Nietzsche, simply because A, I find it undigestible, but B, because I didn't have the time. I had to read other things, and so but then we actually, I think we settled for 218 years, because after that we figured that all the things humans can think. We didn't think about enhanced humans, We just thought of us as being in our limits, which we are. We can go in our daily business, like read and study and converse. We are not enhanced. So that after, 200 years, really, we have had it, because we have gone in circles, Nietzsche again? No. We had that like when I was 97. So come on, let's not read that again. We will choose death now, But on a more practical level, which is also a little bit dirty old man kind of thing. So if I could still live to experience great cyber sex or something, I would find that great. No problems with consensuality. Everything goes allegedly or whatever, and I could change my sex and have sex and change my gender and have orgasmic feelings, and they would merge with music and art and so on. That I would love to experience, But maybe a little bit of LSD will have that effect anyway. Yeah, well, we have done well. It is 2 hours and 26 minutes. However, maybe one very last thing, which was mentioned already. That was what I found really interesting, because we are here at the Biennale, and it was mentioned stuff about art. So where does, our artsy stuff, which we nowadays produce, maybe it relates to transhumanism or so, but would there actually be a particular kind of transhumanist art production?
There is, in the sense that if someone is a painter who has now moved to about 50% digital work, there's definitely a difference in how you conceive. It's the ephemeral nature of something being digital, and I've had to relate different material, even in terms of doing an exhibition recently, where I had to think about, like, I know how to print and even have the originals in terms of a 3D art piece, but how do I relate to my work which is only digital? It's an idea which I have we do it with music now also in different ways. We've been doing it a long time with music, about since sound recordings, but also in theory since written, we were to notation of music and being able to replicate it that way. So for me, that's interesting, like this idea of the ephemeral, kind of, again, symbolic experience of art, which can't be preserved, or can be preserved also in different ways to having a painting. For me, it's a difference, and there's a similarity between doing a digital work and doing a painting, and sometimes I'm mixing up the two a lot.
For me, the interesting thing is if we could expand human senses, then what would painting look like if we broadened the spectrum of
That'd
light
be
that we
amazing.
could see?
We could have like synesthesia type experience, and that would. I took that battery test. Apparently, I have a teeny tendency towards some synesthesia, according to the test I took, which is probably nonsense. But I find that quite interesting. That would be maybe some similarities to what Volker just said. Like it extended of being to smell, taste. In a sense, though, it would still be me potentially as the creator, or perhaps an artificial entity, imposing what we think it would be. And then it would be that old argument of who owns the art. Is it my experience of it, or is it what the intention of the artist is? I always kind of I default to art being about a person's personal experience.
Yeah, I'm very deaf of the author about it.
And not artistic intent. I think it's subjective, but that's a philosophical future.
Yeah, there is such a great diversity of art already, which is sort of classified in the wide field of transhumanist art, or related to transhumanist art. Actually, I've been organizing conferences for 11 years, bringing together transhumanism, critical posthumanism, and two of them have already been dedicated to art, aesthetics, and these movements. And there's, one finds that on the level of composition, music composition. Sven Helbig is an amazing contemporary composer who uses technology, new instruments, a new way of performing in order to represent the non-duality is a central element. But I can only hint at that with this sort of. Another one is a Spanish artist. He has the Metabody project where Stellark is involved as well. He has a wonderful Punchender cyborg. Metaformance is not a performance, but a metaformance. A performance implies still the dualistic distinction between performer and audience, but a metaformance is there is no such distinction anymore. He walks through the audience, which is no longer the audience, but there is sort of the interrelationship between audience and performer. So these dualistic boundaries also get dissolved in that manner, which I think is a very important. Once we move away over the traditional binaries, that has consequences again for all these levels of production. Even if you give a presentation, it's sort of the speaker and the audience that amplifies the binary thinking. So we have the binaries on so many different levels. interesting is also what is being done in the field of using deep learning in order to create new music. I mean, there was a project that was done by Sony Music, but they involved basically all the Beatles songs in order to create a new Beatles song based on all the ones which are available. It's called Daddy's Car, and you can hear the traces of the earlier Beatles, the later Beatles. It's not a bad song. It wouldn't have been, world hit, but it's interesting what has already been. What is already possible.
Yeah.
And that shows sort of the potential, what will be possible even for the future. But it raises also a lot of aesthetic questions.
It's actually raising a question for me, which is when they do a lot of the evolutionary psychology arguments about average faces being most attractive, it's actually not the case that the average faces are the most attractive. It's that they average the face and they come out with an average face. But what people are often more attracted to is distinctiveness in features, whether it's a nose or eyes or lips or whatever, rather than the amalgamation of prototypes. So then how could you, I mean, that would be interesting artistically, because maybe Daddy's Car is the average of it, where it's actually what would make I'm not so into the Beatles, but I recognize that they are, I'm sure they're geniuses in their own right. What would make a genius Beatles song would be something which is distinctive.
Well, is it an average, or is it a machine learning trying to sort of figure out the tricks or the
That's true. Maybe it's distinctive. I haven't heard it.
Well, what is interesting also was I think there were programmers in Japan who created the plot line of a short story. But they created an algorithm which was responsible for every single word. And that entered a short story competition. And it was shortlisted.
That's pretty terrifying for someone
that
like me.
That was interesting. I haven't read it. I mean, not being able to read Japanese, so I can't really comment on the qualities. But it was anonymous. It anonymously entered that competition and it was shortlisted, and that's quite striking.
It really is, yeah. The other thing that suddenly occurred to me is I think there is a transhuman art form already, and that which is an area I work in, which is games, where you do absolutely construct the narrative yourself in conjunction with the parameters that have been set up for you. And, there's an increasing moving into virtual reality and augmented reality and areas that are quite deeply concerned with it. So, yeah, I think I would say that is the post-human art form that currently exists.
And what is that type of the dream art they have, where they're able to take the images or suggestions of images that they've been able to pick up from cognitive signals in the brain, and then there's the fellow or woman who is then enhancing until they get a recognizable object, probably not what the original dream I cannot remember the name of the artist. And then they end up with these incredibly beautiful kind of landscapes usually. Wow. But because they're using machine learning, they often have objects, or suddenly a unicorn pops up, or something strange, or a boat, or maybe something mundane. But it's quite, I'm sorry, whoever you are, you're probably not one of the three listening, so that's okay. World famous artist who does these enhanced, and not just, they do it in process. So over time, it starts to look like something. It's like if you're staring at clouds, and then suddenly it becomes that thing. That is beautiful, I think. Do you know who that is?
No, I just know that sort of by realizing brain-computer interfaces, it was already possible to restructure some images from the brain.
Yeah.
What people look at, and recently, sort of an engineer from Bremen found out and was able to demonstrate that mind reading is possible by means of brain-computer interfaces. That was taken on by Facebook. Facebook now has implemented it. He's got an institute with 60 employees in order to realize mind reading. So the future of typing will be thinking. Our thoughts are no longer free. So the future of use of Facebook, you sleep and all your dreams get uploaded into. That has an enormous implication. Yeah. But he's spending a lot of money. But also in the project.
Positive implications for paraplegics, for example.
Exactly,
but yes.
I mean, so that's why it's not getting boring,
Possibly even art. Also.
For art as well, exactly.
Wow.
Wow, also.
Yes.
What about the artworks you have in mind?
Yeah, no, I have no artsy side, but I'm very fascinated by interacting with artists. And for me, art which then gets me is always art where I don't know why it fascinates me. So it somehow transcends me and takes me to a place where I don't know where I am. And I've never been there. So if the art is too decipherable for me, or I can say why I like it, then it's not very exciting. So what I like is this is a very stupid example, but let's say Mark Rothko, and there is like a canvas and it's just like one big color or so. And I think, my God, this is just incredible. But what is it that, makes me, that I'm so touched by it? So that is the art I do like. In that sense, of course, one could cheesily say that is whatever, transcendent, transhumane, or something like that. I don't know. But I could get us to agree that our feet are cold in this bunker, and that we have a human, not a transhuman, but a human right to have warm feet, and that for that reason we could come to the end of our conversation.
I think we may have reached a natural conclusion.
Is that good? And then
singularity.
Yes, and then that's the very cheesy thing. Here is some sugar. They gave us very bad tea here down in the bunker.
Oh, gosh.
Okay, they gave us very good tea down here in the bunker, and even sugar. And how can you be more cheesy? On the sugar little sachets, the logo of the Biennale is printed, which of course is a very good closing line for anything transhuman, because we don't know whether our transhuman future will be, let me say, having well, we know it will have pros and cons. Will it be a beautiful future? Will it be a dangerous future? But clearly it will be an interesting future, and for that reason, I pronounce, may you live in interesting times.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, all
Thank
of
you
you.
all. It's been a fascinating conversation for me,
one of
if
these
not for our
sugar
three
ones.
listeners.